Here's some little tips and tricks that I use to try to decide whether or not a particular news story deserves my attention right now. Number one that people both on the right and the left are not understanding is what is an executive order. Executive orders are not laws. Only Congress has the power to create law. That is literally the first sentence of the Constitution. But that is literally all Congress can do. Congress just writes on a sheet of paper, there ought to be a law that says yada, 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 and then they just walk away. And it is the job of the president to pick up that paper, and him and his departments and his secretaries and his cabinets do the law. However, sometimes there's a little bit of wiggle room inside that law. An executive order is a statement from the president that says, this is how I want my employees, my executive branch, to interpret this little wiggle room inside of a law. Hugely important thing that nobody seems to be getting, though, is that an executive order cannot nullify a law. If an executive order says, I see a little bit of wiggle room in here, and there isn't actually wiggle room there, or the way that the president wants to interpret that wiggle room is illegal, then the executive order is null. It's void. It's not worth the paper it was printed on. That nullification does not happen automatically, though. First, a federal judge blocks or freezes or pauses the order, and then lawyers from the White House and from public institutions will get together, argue exactly about why this thing is illegal. The judge writes up a summary, and then the order is considered nullified. So a lot of these executive orders are never going to go into effect, or they're only going to go into effect for a short period of time and then be nullified, or they're just going to stay in limbo for a little while, which will create all sorts of chaos and confusion and then be nullified. Whatever. The point is, most of them are just for show. A lot of them have already been paused by a federal judge. So when you see Aaron Parnas say, breaking news, new executive order, don't get all worked up about it yet. Most of the executive orders are just a piece of performance art. They're not an actual piece of rule, law, policy that we're ever going to have to contend with. Here's another tool I use. Whenever a news story starts off with such and such a politician introduced a bill or introduced legislation, definitely don't pay attention to the details, and you probably don't need to pay attention to the story at all. A bill is literally just a suggestion for a law. Most bills will never get passed. Number two, if they do get passed, it's going to take months, often years, sometimes decades. And number three, when they do get passed, they never get passed in their original form. However, in a time of emergency or crisis, usually the process moves pretty quickly. And remember, Republicans have redefined what the word emergency means, or the word crisis. Crisis means anything that is not pressing and urgent, but I feel very strongly about it. I just declare it a crisis because it's a crisis that my feelings aren't being addressed right now at this very moment. So that's the thing to watch out for. Number two, as Aaron Reed and Jessica Valenti have pointed out, state-level Republicans these days have invented this new tactic where many states will introduce a piece of legislation that is almost identical at the same time as a trick to get everyone's attention. So if half a dozen red states introduce, quote-unquote, introduce legislation to say that women can't wear pants anymore, or whatever the fuck is going to be next, it wrestles the narrative back into their control. It puts the attention and the news back in the Republican kind of camp, using proposed legislation as a strategy for doing something else, for controlling narrative, or shifting the Overton window or something like that, as opposed to actually trying to get a law passed. Be mindful when you're reading the news story. Hey, is that what's going on right here, or are people seriously trying to get this law through?